Chapter 18. Adian. The Choice. Adian's mind raced as he only half listened to what was going on around him. It flitted to and fro, desperately searching for solutions, but finding only more impossible questions. How was he supposed to get out of this mess? To get Dre and Asi out? To save the militia members? They couldn't possibly fight their way out. There were so many infected creatures that even if they didn't fight back, Adian would starve to death before cutting down a tenth of them. How were there so many creatures? How had Tega managed to corrupt so many and so quickly? All the forests of nearby lands must have been empty to create such an army whose vast size removed any chance of rescue, since even if they had a way to call for help, and the time to wait for it, only legions led by the heroes of old could hope to overcome such numbers. Could they perhaps reason with the crazed dungeon bound before them? Unlikely. Dre's relation to the creature seemed more of a curse than a boon at this point. It would take a great work of the Creator to be granted mercy by Tega. The thought reignited an internal battle Adian had been struggling with since regaining consciousness in the tunnels. Why was his loving Creator allowing such terrible things to happen to him? He knew the logical reasoning that he had been taught about why the Creator allowed evil in the world, but that logic felt so cold, so distant, while his indignation at the current injustice burned hot within him. He was so trapped in the current situation that he couldn't find the perspective that he knew would bring him clarity. His problems were at the forefront and were so large that they completely filled his view. As a tutor had once told him, a walnut can blot out a mountain if held close enough to the eye, just as our problems can seem larger than the Creator if we allow ourselves to focus on them.
The moment of reckoning has arrived. Now you must choose, little brother. Who shall live and who shall die?
Tega's harsh words shocked Adian out of his internal musings. As his conscious mind re-entered the situation, it caught up with what he had subconsciously heard. He stared in horror as Tega slowly placed the hilt of a glowing dagger into Dre's trembling hands. Adian's gaze followed Tega as the half-man, half-monster stalked towards the line of prostrate prisoners. Tega grabbed hold of a man wearing painfully familiar plate armor. He wrenched him and his armor off the ground, as easily as a mother picking up a toddler. Adian's heart ached at the sight. The lifeless, expressionless man was unrecognizable when compared to the jovial companion that Adian had grown to love. But the man's face wasn't covered in enough blood and grime for him to be mistaken for anyone else. It was Gavin, but he was broken. Tega dropped the knight unceremoniously in front of Dre, who stood motionless as he stared at the sickly weapon in his hands. Asia was curled into a trembling ball beside him, her eyes locked in unfocused horror at the scene before her. Tega towered over them both, a cruel smirk tugging at the moss-covered side of his face. Adian could hardly breathe. The silence stretched and the tension grew until Tega, his tone a growling purr, once again asked, "Who will live and who will die?" Dre didn't respond at first, but his gaze shifted from the dagger to Gavin, who lay motionless in front of him. Too motionless. He slowly looked up at his brother, and in a tone laced with poorly concealed anger, he asked, "What have you done to him?" Tega smirked. "I just gave him a few herbs to help with the fear and anxiety. That stuff will kill you if you let it." Dre snorted in disgust. "You don't seem all that concerned with my fear, with Adian's, with Asia's." "I suppose that I could use some on the bard, since I need nothing from him. But why bother? He's already such a good pet." Tega flashed a mocking smile at Adian, who surprisingly found himself having to restrain his irrational anger at being misclassed once again. Adian didn't have long to dwell on his annoyance, because Tega immediately turned back to Dre and continued, "As for you and Asia, I can't afford to dull your senses. This is all for you. You both need to know, to feel, to remember exactly what you are seeing and doing. It has to be of your own free and unadulterated will. I want you to lower yourself, to come down to my sickly level of morality, that choice, the pain of that choice. It will prove your love for her." Tega smiled at Dre, and the cruelty in it drained the heat from Adian's blood. The monster's cruel expression turned to one of concern when he took notice of Asia. "But perhaps she does need something. Not to dull her senses, but to snap her out of the shock." He turned, walked behind his throne. and entered a small room that Adian hadn't noticed before, since it blended in so well with the rock surrounding it. Adian's heart leapt. Tega was gone. Was this their chance at escape? But it only took one backwards glance at the mass of creatures behind him for the hope to die in his chest. By the time he returned his gaze forward, Tega was already exiting the stone doorway with a bright red leaf pinched between his long, moss-covered fingers. He knelt before Asya, crushed the leaf in his hand, lifted her head, and poured the powdered remains into her open mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, awareness returned to her wide eyes. Her breath quickened, and her gaze darted about in a panic until it locked onto Dre. That's when she began to cry. In long, gasping, desperate sobs, she cried and wailed. Tega smiled and sighed. "That's better," he said, just loud enough to be heard over her grief. Asya's energy didn't last long, though, and soon a heavy silence again hung over all of them. A silence once again broken by Tega.
"Dear brother, I can allow you to hesitate no longer. You must choose."
His voice changed for the last 3 words. His tone became deeper and darker. It was half speech and half growl. It was a terrible sound, the polar opposite of the beauty Adian tried to bring into the world with his music. It carried a magical weight, and it physically pained Adian to hear it. Adian could only watch as Dre struggled with the meaning of the words instead of the sound of them. He seemed unsure, stuck. But then his gaze shifted to Asya. She had stopped crying and was slowly shaking her head side to side, her gaze full of steel. Dre must have drawn strength from the sight, because his own expression hardened. He turned to Tega. "No," he said softly, but then shouted at the top of his lungs, "No! No one needs to die. I will not do your bidding. I will not turn myself into the kind of monster you have already become." Tega didn't respond at first. His expression was blank, and his head slowly bobbed up and down, as if in agreement with Dre's words. But then, in a flash of movement nearly too quick for Adian to follow with the naked eye, Tega bent down, grabbed Asya, then stood up and tossed her all in one motion. She screamed in terror as she sailed at least 20 feet in the air before crashing down hard onto the rock floor with an audible snapping sound. She tumbled violently along the ground, her head and limbs bouncing off the ground sickeningly. By the time she came to a stop, the screaming had ended. Her ankle was stuck at an odd angle. A large bloody gash had opened across her forehead. Tears streamed in rivulets down her face as a silent scream tried and failed to escape her throat. Adian stared in horror and shock. It had all been so quick, so violent. He had never even had a chance to intervene. But even if he could have, what would he have done? What could he do now? Nothing. Dre obviously did not feel the same, because he was being restrained from running to Asya. Dre may have been physically strong, both naturally and from the enhancements provided by his class, but he could not match the strength of his brother's giant form. Still, Dre fought and screamed and tried to break free, but no matter what he did, he could not slip the grip that Tega had on the wrist of the hand that still held the dagger. Even as the two of them continued to struggle, a bear trotted over to Asya and grabbed a mouthful of her dress. It dragged her, screaming, until she was lying next to the vacant-eyed Gavin. Her crying had ceased, and even though her face was contorted with pain, Adian could still see the same steel conviction breaking through. She looked up at Dre, who had stopped struggling, and spoke in a strained tone as gasps of pain broke apart her words. "Dre, we are already dead. He won't let us escape and tell the world what we have seen here. Don't corrupt your soul by playing his game." Tega only laughed.
"Feel free to listen to her, brother, even if she unknowingly lies. But trust me, if you do not choose to save her, then she will die first. Then the bard, and then you. But if you choose to spare her, then I will let the two of you leave. I swear it."
Dre turned to look over his shoulder and snarled,
"And why should I trust you?" Tega grinned. "I swear on the Creator. I swear on our father. No, our mother's life. I swear on my class. I swear on my dungeon."
This time, it was Dre who laughed.
Your words mean nothing to me, monster.
Adian felt knots forming in his stomach as he watched Tega's expression harden.
I guess that's your answer, then.
His gaze shifted to the corrupted bear that still loomed over Asya, and in an almost conversational tone he said,
Bite off her head.
Instantly, the bear lunged. "Stop!" Adian shouted as he squeezed his eyes shut, and at the same time he heard Dre scream, "No! Don't hurt her! I'll do anything!" Then there was silence. Adian didn't dare to breathe. He slowly cracked an eye open, and his heart stopped when he saw the entirety of Asya's head was inside of the giant bear's maw. But it started beating again when he realized that the bear's jaws had stopped just before its teeth pierced her skin. The scene stayed frozen like that until Tega let out a soft whistle, and the bear backed away. Tega spun Dre towards him and leaned forward until the two of them were eye to eye.
Prove it!
Adian watched in horrified fascination as Tega's words transformed the fearful expression on Dre's face into a rictus of wrath. The packman turned, with hard eyes towards Gavin, who lay deathly still in front of him. He shook his shoulders free of a madly grinning Tega and took 2 purposeful steps forward until he loomed over the armored man. He paused then, and Adian hoped against hope that the young man had thought of some clever way to appease Tega without... But then Dre moved. In one violently fluid motion, he knelt and plunged the knife into the side of Gavin's neck. Adian couldn't believe what he was seeing. He hadn't thought that Dre would actually... But what other choice did the boy have? The attack had come so quickly. Adian hadn't even had a chance to call out, to beg for his friend's life. Asya's muffled crying could be heard even with her head pressed against the ground. Dre sat, stunned, from where he had stumbled and fallen after his attack. Adian couldn't look at either of them. Instead, he stared at the glowing tip of the dagger, which protruded a few inches from the side of Gavin's throat. The man hadn't screamed. He hadn't even flinched. Adian's sluggish mind tried to understand, but as he observed the scene before him, a rather large incongruity drew his attention. Why wasn't there any blood? As if the thought had spurred the world into action, something began to ooze out of the wound. But it wasn't blood. No. Instead, small green fibers grew out of the wound at a speed visible to the naked eye. The fibers twisted and weaved around each other until they became a familiar, wretched sight. It was the sickly green moss that had become seemingly ever-present in Adian's world over the past few days. The moss grew and carpeted the exit wound, as well as the dagger point itself. That's when the knife began to move, not because someone had grabbed the handle. No. As if it had a will of its own, the moss slowly pushed the magic weapon out of Gavin's throat until it clattered noisily to the ground. Within moments, moss had sealed the entrance wound as well, like stitchwork on a torn garment. Nothing happened for a long moment after that. At least, Adian thought nothing was happening, until he noticed a vein in Gavin's forehead had started to bulge like it did when the knight grew angry. Then the veins on his throat began to writhe and wriggle, as if they had all been transformed into large worms. The sickly mutation spread like an expanding spiderweb until every visible scrap of flesh was covered with engorged veins that glowed green through thinly stretched skin. Adian prayed that it would stop there, that Gavin's corpse would not be desecrated further, but the creator didn't listen. Instead, the moss began growing up the sides of his neck. It crawled over his chin, filled his mouth, then split at the nose, so that 2 thin strands of moss simultaneously reached towards his closed eyelids. Gavin's eyes snapped open, and Adian's heart sank even further into the depths of despair. His eyeballs were gone, replaced by moss that glowed a bright, haunting green. The thing that had once been Gavin moved. It slowly stood, turned towards Tega, and opened its mouth into a terrible, moss-filled grin. A smile spread across Tega's face in reply. The dungeon-bound took a small, almost hesitant step forward, and reached out a hand to caress the moss-filled wound. He leaned forward and gently kissed Gavin's corpse on the forehead. Adian's vision grew blurry, and it was only then that he realized he had fallen to his knees and that he was crying. Tega turned his attention to Dre, and his surprisingly genuine smile turned predatory.
Thank you, my brother. My first human convert is... He's more than I could have hoped for.
He snapped his fingers, and the bear that had backed away from Asya trotted forward, grabbed her hair in its mouth, and lifted her head so that she had no choice but to look and see what Dre had done. Her eyes widened at the sight of the armored monster that now lurked behind Tega. Her gaze dropped to the knife at Dre's feet and then shifted up to his face. Her expression shifted from terror to sorrow. Dre didn't meet her eyes. His face was as expressionless as granite. He stayed that way until Tega spoke, his tone more sincere than before.
That's one down, brother. But the hardest part is over. The seal on your ignorant innocence has been broken. Doing what is necessary will only get easier. Trust me, I would know.
Adian watched in disbelief as Dre's blank expression morphed into one of pure hatred as he slowly raised his head. He locked eyes with Tega for a long, tense moment, but he didn't say a word. Instead, at a measured pace, he picked up the glowing dagger, stood, and walked over to the line of motionless humans who were now all kneeling, their blank faces raised, eyes staring at the dragon's gold moss lighting the room from above. Dre stopped, a hair's breadth away from the first in line, a young woman with lifeless eyes who swayed slightly, as if to an unfelt breeze. Tega laughed.
Finally you understand, brother. Now choose.
After only a moment of hesitation, Dre did. In one fluid, horrible movement, Dre stabbed the knife into the young woman's throat. Adian wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Once again, moss seeped out of the wound rather than blood. She began to transform as well, but not in the same way as Gavin. Instead, wherever the moss grew, her skin melted like wax. Asya closed her eyes and wailed. Dre's face contorted with disgust, guilt, and rage before he looked away. Adian vomited violently on the ground. All while Tega's booming laugh echoed throughout the cavern. Then it all happened again, as if they were trapped in a chronomancer's hellish time loop.
Choose, Tega roared.
Dre stabbed a gray-bearded man in the eye. Moss grew out of the wound until it covered his entire head. Asya wailed. Dre grimaced and looked away. Tega laughed. Adian retched. Then it happened again.
Choose.
Stab. And again.
Choose.
Stab. Again.
Choose.
Stab.
Choose.
Stab.
Choose.
Stab.
Choose.
Stab.
Choose.
Stab.